this weekend we're beginning a new message series that I've called, What Are You Looking For? We just heard in the Gospel, 10 lepers came to meet him. They stood some way off and called to him, Jesus, Master, take pity on us. Their request actually sets the scene for this series because throughout these next 4 weeks we will meet people, others, either in fact or in story, who come looking for answers to serious issues in their lives. And as we listen to the stories, we see how Jesus, in some way or other, impacts their lives and provides the answers to their prayer. Now, all the stories that we will hear during the series are familiar stories, which means that we can run the risk of hearing the story and then shutting down, rather than really listening to what is happening in the interactions between Jesus and those who are involved. As usual, the practice of the liturgy is that an Old Testament reading goes with the Gospel, and the two line up so that there is a theme from the Gospel which then is relayed into in the Old Testament, which is then relayed into the Gospel passage. It's in our second readings, however, from the letters of Paul to Timothy, the second reading of today, and then the letter to the Thessalonians, where we'll see Paul, while we don't talk about it a lot in the series, we'll see Paul exhorting the people to make choices about what it means for them to really follow the risen Lord and to understand what God is doing in and through them as they live out their gospel, the message. But let's go back to the gospel, and we start this one with one that is very well known, the curing of the 10 lepers. Jesus' words to them are very simple words. He says, go and show yourselves to the priests. Now one, as we know, the Samaritan comes back to thank him. I have to say that in my young life, all I ever thought about was that the Samaritan was grateful and the other 9 were ungrateful. But maybe it's not quite as simple as that. When the Samaritan returned, Jesus stood in the road and he was worried about the 9 who didn't come back instead of the one who was in front of him. He said, were not all 10 made clean? Where are the other 9? Well, the answer is they were doing exactly as Jesus had told them to do. Jesus had said, go and show yourself to the priests. And that's what they were doing. It's an odd story. It just tells something of what the situation at the time was like. 10 lepers, staying that proper distance from healthy people as they were required by the law, asked Jesus to take pity on them. It isn't specified what they actually meant. It might have been the language that they used whenever they met anybody. They were seeking alms or food or clothing or shelter. They may not have even known who Jesus was, except that he was a teacher passing through. But without touching them, or without even coming near them, Jesus sent them off to show themselves to the priests. Mysteriously, without any additional action by Jesus, without any other words, they're cured. If we stop and think about it, it seems that their cure came not from a touch or a word, but from obedience, which I suspect is a kind of faith, especially for the people that we're talking about. Their journey towards fulfilling what the requirements of the law were about actually led them to healing. But the crux of the story is that only one of them understood that something else had happened. The other 9 seemed to be ordinary religious people doing what they were told to do. Certainly they were happy, but we know nothing more about them, not even if they were actually Jews or Samaritans. We only know that the one who came back was a Samaritan. This Samaritan realized that something special had happened to him, more than just a cure. He had not only received the pity he'd requested, but in doing that, he became somebody who had been given a whole of new life. Instead of going to the priest, he returned to Jesus, almost crazy with delight, shouting and singing God's praise. And what did Jesus do? Instead of dancing with him, instead of celebrating, he looks at him and says, "Where are the other 9? You can almost feel, I've just had something really special happen to me, and you're asking me about the other 9? I didn't even notice they weren't with me. I was so pleased, I was coming to say thank you." The question is, when Jesus said, "Were not all 10 made clean?" is he actually asking a question, or is he making a statement? Was Jesus actually lamenting the fact that, like the mustard seed last week, where we were told if we had faith the size of a mustard seed we could do anything, that after all of his efforts, he'd got a pass mark of 1 out of 10. Now, I don't know whether you ever got 1 out of 10 in an exam, but that's really not a pass mark. And you think, is it a statement? I only got 1 out of 10? So Jesus is actually asking, what's happening? We don't know whether Jesus did rejoice over the one who understood what he was being offered. But what he did say to the man was something quite profound. He bent over him and said, "Stand up and go on your way. Your faith has healed you." As Jesus tells the story, 3 distinct things have happened to the various lepers. First, as they went to present themselves to the priests, they were all cured. That is, the signs of their disease had disappeared. Secondly, one had realised that he'd been more than cured. He was made whole again. And finally, Jesus tells him, "Your faith has saved you." This man who was saved fell at Jesus' feet, singing loud praises, demonstrating that he actually recognised what God had done for him. We see something new happening. For this man has received more than a simple cure. Like Naaman from our first reading, Naaman the Syrian, whose healing in the waters of the Jordan led him to worship the God of Israel. This one too, the Samaritan, had undergone a metanoia, a complete change of heart that had turned his life around. Pope Francis reminds us of this in his encyclical, Evangelii Gaudium, when he writes, "Joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, emptiness, and loneliness." This Samaritan man had learned that with Christ, joy is constantly born anew. That this story encourages us to give thanks to God is a good thing. But if we stop there, it's kind of selling the story short. 10 people with leprosy asked to be cured. 9 received their health and quite probably returned to their homes rejoicing from the life and being able to rejoin the life that they'd been cut off from. The 10th man somehow realised that there was more available to him than just that. He was more than restored. His interaction with Jesus brought him into God's healing presence, the joy of the gospel. So if we stop and think, if we listen to this story, this incident told as a story, it becomes a parable about prayer. We can ask for what we need and rejoice when we receive it. We can live as ordinary religious people, grateful for what we have. Or, taking Naaman and this believer as our examples, we can make the subtext of every prayer a plea that we may recognise and be ready to receive the joy God wants to give us. As St. Paul assures us in the letters to Timothy and Thessalonians, we're constantly being offered more than we can ask or imagine. That's the breadth of God's mercy. As I said at the beginning, the theme of this series is, what are you looking for? I suspect today the subtext could be, what are you prepared to ask for?